Paso a Paso podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Paso a Paso podcast, otherwise lovingly known as the Paso Podcast, a Taos, New Mexico-based network of early childhood educators and family providers. And that is exactly what we're going to get into today on this episode. We have a wonderful guest here, Tracy from UNM Taos Kids Campus. And Tracy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. My name is Tracy Jaramillo. I am the director at UNM Taos Kids Campus and one of the original founders of the Paso Paso Network.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge with us. Can you first explain, since you mentioned it, what the UNM Kids Campus is?
So UNM Taos Kids Campus is an early childhood program and lab school for the early childhood department within the university. And we serve children 6 weeks to 5 years old. We have approximately 55 students a day and serve about 65 families.
Wow. Thank you. And for those listening, given that this is one of our first episodes, UNM is, of course, University of New Mexico, and they do have a campus here in Taos, although their home base is in Albuquerque. And you mentioned Paso, Tracy, and your involvement in it. Paso is going to be the focus of this podcast series. We're first going to do some interviews with the network members to learn more about their programs and what they have to offer the community. But overall, how would you describe Paso and what's some of its history?
So Paso really is a network of community agencies that work together to serve the children and families of our community. Paso came out of an original group that met together in the late 1990s. We came together 4 times per year to share information about what programs across our community were doing. And there was a real emphasis on supporting one another and learning from one another instead of competing with one another for funds. And from that original group, in 2001, we formalized into what was known as the Taos Early Childhood Community Network, which had more than 60 members and continued to share information about community services about young children and families, dealing with young children and families. And then in 2004, the Taos Early Childhood Task Force was formed, and that was formed out of an identified need to identify the service gaps in our community around early childhood education. And really, that was at the period of time when New Mexico PreK was being developed, and so we had a large voice in talking to state officials about how that was going to play out.
Wow. And so there's been quite a few developments since the origins of Paso initiated, as you said, in the late 90s. Maybe starting back around that time, can you kind of create a vision for us? In what ways was the landscape of early childhood professionals and service providers, how did it feel different than it does today?
It felt very different. There were many early childhood programs and nonprofit agencies in our community that were providing services and were very territorial and competitive with one another. And that stemmed basically just from, each program trying to survive and do the best they could. I can't remember back in those days how many nonprofit agencies there were in our community, but I think it was well over 100. So the competition was stiff and intense. So several community members, Brandy Corey in particular, really identified the need to just come to the same table and start sharing what each of us were doing, and identify ways we could start supporting each other instead of competing with one another.
Amazing. You also mentioned more recently that the group was instrumental in working with the state to look at New Mexico PreK. For those who might not be familiar with that period of time or that transition, what was it that the state was working on, and what did that involvement look like?
So the state was looking at publicly funded programming for 4-year-olds across the state. They developed, at that time, it was the Technical Assistance and Support Agency for the state, and had an office here. They were working closely in terms of identifying the needs, what that program should look like, how it would align with what was then the STAR quality rating of programs.
So, given that history and all that you've seen through the years in the field, how do you feel about where things are now, and where do you think they're headed?
Well, let me just tell you that. So, out of the Tekken, Paso evolved with funding from the HRSA Office of Rural Health Policy, who gave us quite a bit of money to really formalize the network and identify, kind of the structure and process that we used. And that really not only formalized our network, but over these years, we have really become a tight, collaborative community of agencies working together to provide services to our children and families.
A recent development in the short time that I've worked with Paso has been the state department. Is it correctly titled the Department of Early Childhood Education and Care?
Yes, that's correct.
And that, I imagine, if not already, is anticipated to change or suggest or collaborate with Paso and other organizations and the state government moving forward. I don't have a sense, and I'm wondering if our listeners do, of given at this point of time, outside of COVID, but in our state and with that department forming, what do you foresee is changing as a result of it? If you could kind of guess about, the near future.
So I think the focus of our leadership in general right now under our current governor, and certainly with the formation of this new department, there's a real emphasis on bridging across systems. So cross-system alliance. So that means bringing under one roof home visiting, early childhood education, home providers, infant mental health. So all similar to what really Paso has been doing. It is now that same idea on a state level, and really working together to create the strongest possible systems available.
Paso, as the listeners are getting to know, is a network of organizations. it really kind of hit home when you were sharing that history of being non-competitive. It sounds as though it was both more competitive before this alliance began, as well as that there were tons of providers. Do you feel as though the providers that are supporting families here in Taos now all kind of have roles that are more unique than the other? Maybe are I'm just trying to compare and contrast and understand how there could have been 100 providers and how it would have been different in that way.
Well, it wasn't 100 providers. I was speaking to 100 nonprofit agencies in our community. So it was just a time when there were a lot of agencies going for minimal resources.
In our last few minutes, again, thanks for your time and insight on all of this. I've gotten the sense through conversations with members of PASO and others in the state that there may be an interest, just as there is at the state level, in encouraging and supporting communities around New Mexico to form these sorts of networks. Do you have any suggestions for things that they should keep in mind as they move forward? Of course, it's hard for us to know exactly where their communities are currently, but anything you'd like to share as maybe this sort of model spreads?
First the conversations have to begin and relationships made that will establish trust within community. And it really takes everybody working together to move forward, both identifying needs and figuring out solutions, and who is the best agency to take the lead in any particular project. I know that there's a strong network in the southern south of Albuquerque, I think down in the Cruces area as well. And actually, the UNM Taos Family Development Center, under the direction of Lois Vermilia, they're out of Albuquerque, has just been contracted by the state to start some kind of network development and communication across these state early childhood networks, and also lend support in network development. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, thanks again for providing some context for the history of Paso. And these coming episodes, as we mentioned before, there will be interviews with various organizations and individuals who are members of the network. And we hope that our listeners will get to know us all better, as well as feel free to reach out to any of the programs, whether they're living in Taos area or abroad. I imagine if folks want to get out in touch with you, they could, of course, reach out to pasotaos.org and hit the contact page, or email us at pasotaos@gmail.com. Otherwise, you are located at UNM Taos at the Kids Campus. And thanks so much for your work that you continue to do and have done all these years, and for sharing that with us today.
Well, thank you, Miles, and thanks for getting the word out about the importance of early childhood.
All right. Well, have a great day.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us on our first episode of the Paso podcast. This recording was done in August of 2020, and we will have episodes coming out every few weeks, featuring many other Paso Network organizations. You'll get to know some of the staff there. We'll ask some questions about their programming and how you can get involved. We also have the website, pasotaos.org. If you ever have a question about the podcast or anything you hear, or just about Taos in general, feel free to reach out. There is a contact there at pasotaos.org. Also, our email is pasotaos@gmail.com. We are also on social media, so if you're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, reach out at Paso Taos. That's at PASOTAOS. We appreciate you listening, appreciate our relationship with KNCE, and all of our network partners and families we serve. Until next time, Thanks for listening to the Paso Podcast.